Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Brian Heap today. He's well known in this room because he was master of this college until about 18 months ago, so he's often stood and talked from this point. But he has a much longer career than that. Most recently he's been head of the Babraham Institute, and then after he left that he was vice president of the Royal Society and foreign secretary, so he travelled a great deal around the world. And a whole host of other things, which if I repeated them, you wouldn't get to his lecture at all. But it's a great pleasure to have Brian with us. I suppose the most pertinent thing he's doing most recently is that he's chairman of the advisory panel on sustainable consumption and production for evidences for DEFRA. And today he's going to talk about a Christian perspective on sustainability, consumption and well-being. So thank you very much, Brian. We look forward to it.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, and particularly to speak about this subject, which has been something of considerable interest to me over the last 10 years in particular, from the time when I was Vice President of the Royal Society, when sustainability was one of the topics in my portfolio. And in this seminar, which I'm giving jointly with Flavio Kermin, my colleague here at St Edmunds, who's an economist, and therefore you will see some interpolations from the economist side. But in this seminar, we want to argue that sustainable consumption and production, sustainable production, derive their substance from Christian messages and values about stewardship and responsibility, and that they are fundamental to the future success and the planetary survival of humankind. And we're going to concentrate on the first world, where we face the challenges of overconsumption, whereas in the second and the third world, of course, the greater problems are frequently ones of underconsumption and low levels of production. This isn't to relegate the importance of the problem in less developed countries at all, but to promote the awareness of our own dilemma in the first world, which we too often prefer to neglect or ignore. And we focus on the Christian message because it does not always receive the attention it deserves in this area. And it's quite interesting to note that even in Nature this very week, the publication which draws attention to the fact that the Church joins the crusade over climate change, and there you see our good friend Sir John Porton, who is the co-chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The topic is complex, and I'm going to abbreviate it quite frequently as SCP, and it demands a multidisciplinary approach, and the strategy needs to speak to the wider community, including policymakers and politicians. So let's start by, first of all, just reminding ourselves of where this concern comes from about consumption and environmental degradation. Several thousand years ago, Abraham had become very wealthy with livestock, silver and gold, and Genesis 13 tells us in the Bible that declining soil fertility forced Abraham and his nephew Lot to go their separate ways. The land was not sufficient, it says, to accommodate them both. There were too many of them, and there were too many possessions, it says. They had too many possessions. So unsustainability has a long history. But concern about consumption was expressed a few years ago in 1997 by the Royal Society of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, as you can see here. Concern that it makes transformed materials energy less available for future use, negatively impacts biophysical systems, threatens human health, welfare, and other things people value. And quite often at this point people say, oh yes, it's all to do with world population. And yes, world population is a big issue. It started to grow exponentially, as you can see, 200 years ago. It doubled in the past 50 years, and it's set to reach about 9.5 billion by 2050. It will stabilise around this figure, either because of socioeconomic factors, people believe, or fertility control, or because of unsustainable consumption levels. But it's not as simple as that. Individual consumption levels are, I would almost say, of even greater importance. Let me just give you an example. The population of Bangladesh is increasing by 50 times annually that of the increase in the UK. But our consumption of fossil fuel is increasing 45 times over that of Bangladesh. So consumption, particularly in the first world, is a topic which really does need our very careful consideration and analysis. In addition, prosperity is spreading, and more individuals in the emerging economies worldwide now live a lifestyle that was once limited to rich nations. Now this is laudable and entirely legitimate, and let's look at some figures. Look at the new consumers in 2000, percentage of the population in brackets. China, 302 million, 24% of the population. And these are the top 4 countries in terms of what is defined as new consumers. What is a new consumer? A new consumer is defined as an average 4-member household who possess purchasing power parity of at least $2,500 per person. Now, while the average Chinese and Indian still consumes much less than the average North American and European, their combined consumer class is larger than that of Western Europe, and it's growing. Now, alongside these statistics, overconsumption and environmental degradation are common, as, for example, in the unsustainable consumption of fish. So here's an example of unsustainable consumption. You can see how it's dropped below that 1964 level, and in many parts of the North Sea and the North Atlantic and Northeast Atlantic, there has been continual fishing in spite of the best scientific evidence to the contrary. Or, for example, in the extraction of water, and we have a number of examples of where the extraction of fossil water for irrigation is clearly going to be a long-standing and serious problem in the future. Therefore, prosperity, we want to argue, gained at the expense of the habitability of the planet would be perverse, and a willful denial of messages about stewardship and responsibility, which, as we know, are strongly portrayed in the Judeo-Christian teaching. But there's another element that we need to pay attention to, and that concerns intergenerational criteria and global equity. So a second concern relates to these aspects, because over the last 50 years, perhaps you could just move the projector a little way this way to get that other edge onto the screen. Thank you. You can see the fold increase in population, food, energy, and economy. And what we notice from this slide, and the projection for 1995-2050, is that everything is growing faster than the population. So everything to do with food, energy, and the GDP factors have been growing faster than the population size, which says something about our consumption. Business as usual scenarios suggest they'll slow down, but they're calculated to show that energy, for example, will have a 5-fold increase over the next 100 years. Now, consumption is perceived as part of our well-being. It's an innate drive to acquire, and this may have increased the survival prospects of our early human ancestors, but it's something that's still very strong. And today, the difference only lies in the fact that we think we exert rational analysis, and that plays a part in human choices, since our choices are not just immediate and inbuilt. The problem is they're insatiable. And if we compare, for example, consumption in less and more developed countries, 25% of the world's richest, 86% of private consumption, and look at what we consume on the left-hand side, 45% meat, 58% energy, 84% paper, compared with the poorest fifth in the world on this side, less than 5%. We also have 74% telephone lines, 87% vehicles, and so on. So if we compare less and more developed countries, it reinforces the concern about global inequalities and social security and international security. Therefore, we need to distinguish between a singular view of consumption and production that reflects individualistic trends and selfish behaviour, and a normative position that addresses how we should behave for social and moral forms of consumption and production that enhance the well-being for ourselves, our planet, and for future generations. This is where the intergenerational concern comes in. But what about equitable distribution and well-being? Let's follow that through a little more. Because for most people, well-being is the main, if not the only, ultimate objective of life, and people these days place a lot of emphasis on it. And there have been a lot of attempts to deconstruct subjective well-being into finer and finer units, as you can see here. They're difficult to quantify, but there has been research done on the use of physiological and neurobiological indicators, observed social and non-verbal behaviour, and also person surveys. And Richard Layard, who published a book last year entitled Happiness, don't particularly recommend it, there's a number of weaknesses in it, but he concludes that there are 5 big factors that come to the top when you consider well-being. In order: family relationships, financial situation, work, community and friends, and health. Personal freedom, personal values, they all come in. Nearly all the surveys show that material standard of living is one of the key. Consumption is one of the key things that people care a great deal about. And it's regularly mentioned by a majority of the respondents as being one of the most important elements of happiness. For example, if we look at the USA, and this isn't going to be an anti-USA talk, I can assure you, we're just as bad in Europe. But look at students. The last 20,000 students going to college in the USA, rising from 40% up to 70% over time. Percent saying it's very important to be very well off financially. Percent saying it's very important to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Or self-reported happiness and personal wealth, which is perhaps even more fascinating, because here we see on the right-hand side that once you get up to a salary, a stipend or whatever, about $8,000 per annum, your personal income is climbing over this period of time. But look at the impact on the happiness evaluation. No change in happiness.
You can't see the scale on the right.
Okay, this scale is $2,000 to $18,000. And the right,
Percentage.
yeah, so yes, sorry, we're losing it. So it's from 0 to 90, yeah. So it's very static at around 30% in terms of percentage, said to be very happy. And clearly there's many reasons why higher income and natural prosperity don't simply translate into greater happiness. We compare ourselves with other people and with their relative income. Relative income becomes important. For example, lottery winners, it is now known, are very happy immediately after winning, but their happiness levels revert back near to the original level after some weeks. Therefore, sustainable consumption and production, can we consider it as an alternative paradigm to the sort of life and lifestyle that we used to? Because it does confront self-interest and greed and exploitation. And the definition that I think is quite useful is that is defined as continuous economic and social progress that respects the limits of the Earth's ecosystems and meets the needs and aspirations of everyone for a better quality of life now and for the future generations to come. Churches Together in Britain and Ireland published a document last year called Prosperity with a Purpose, and it reminds us that God's original creative work made order out of chaos, and our calling is to make more order yet, and to work creatively, and to cooperate with God's creativity as human beings made in the image of God. I go on to say, by making this increase in goods and services available to individuals and communities, we connect work and endeavour to wealth creation and well-being, even before they connect to socio-political systems or fiscal measures. And what I'd like to do now is to move the question to what extent might we anticipate that we can address these serious problems of use of the Earth's resources and so on. And I want us to look at it in terms, initially, of how we might address it in terms of science and technology. The area is called dematerialization and informed consumption. And it involves efficiency measures that reduce consumption of natural resources, decouples economic growth and environmental impact, creates new materials with reuse properties, and conservation of biodiversity. And so these are key areas that fall under this topic of using less to create more, or using it a different way, adopting different lifestyles, dematerialization and informed consumption. For example, the EU, it's transformed its energy infrastructure over the last 30 years, and it's reduced its use of carbon for energy needs by 0.75% per year. Clear dematerialization. For example, 1.1 gigatons of carbon required to produce 49 exojoules. That's each 49 times 18 zeros in terms of the total energy produced. Whereas you see in 1971, same amount of carbon was used to produce significantly less energy. These are the different forms, sources of energy. But by 2050, it's projected that 0.5 gigatons of carbon should be producing 36 exojoules. We have different types of cars. You'll recognize the Prius here. We have geothermal production. We have solar energy, wind energy, alternatives, nuclear power, and not just coal-fired furnaces. And an alternative source of energy, these alternative sources of energy, of course, are becoming increasingly important. And in the USA, using the maize crop for bioethanol has shown a striking increase over the last few years, very dramatic. Construction industry, One Planet Living. Here's an example for what's called zero squared living, zero waste and zero carbon, in the Thames Gateway regeneration east of London area. Here's the same type of project being developed by Bioregional and WWF in Barcelona. And this system, which involves, and there's a very good example of it in London, competitively priced houses with electricity from combined heat and power, using wood taken from the sustainable pruning of trees in London streets. There are shared cars, the city car system, with low allergy building material, minimizing respiratory problems. There are recycling techniques to reduce waste, and that's resulted in a scheme of 82 houses which are carbon neutral. The long-term objective is this one here, zero waste, zero carbon. Plant breeding advances, and before I go on to that, this just reminds us that the carbon savings of the Beddington Zero Energy Development Project that I was just referring to, a friend of mine who's provided these data, who's working on this project, a total saving, carbon saving of 41%. He's totally changed his lifestyle, particularly in terms of transport and using other methods. Plant breeding is another example where genetically modified crops have reduced the chemical burden on the environment, safer for farmers who are exposed to lower levels of pesticides, diminished waste and pollution. And a new hybrid rice in Africa, for example, has given 50% more grain than current varieties when cultivated in traditional rain-fed systems without the use of chemical fertilizers. So here's the GM pattern worldwide. Here it is in industrial countries, less developed countries, and here you see complete absence in Europe. So much work is urgently needed. I'm just giving a few examples, but much work is urgently needed to quantify whether the aggregate of technological fixes could counter the phenomena of global climate change, damaged environments and depleted resources, as they have done in the past very largely. But in formulating a definition of sustainable consumption and production, a compromise is almost unavoidable between the technological and ethical dimensions of economic decisions in order to carry enough consensus for practical purposes. So we see, therefore, that freedom exists to choose or reject initiatives of this type. These are options that will mitigate the negative impacts of overconsumption on the integrity of the created order and its renewal. However, serious doubts persist about whether this freedom will be sufficient in itself, and we must now turn to behaviour and lifestyle. Marty Sen, former master of Trinity, who's worked closely with us here on issues to do with capabilities and sustainability, he said that a strategy of sustainable consumption and production lies at the heart of the concept of sustainable development. And it enriches our understanding of sustainable development because it emphasizes the need for consumption habits and attitudes to change. And several options exist to influence behavior and lifestyle, including deliberative democracy and public participation. And I want to give three examples. The first one has to do with the government's guiding principles, which have just been published in this area as the framework for a vigorous public debate about the policies that would support efficient consumption, appropriate investment choices, and sustainable production. They perhaps sound a little like motherhood and apple pie, but they include the use of sound science in a responsible way, living within the environmental limits, achieving a sustainable economy, and striving for a strong and just society. And indicators are clearly one means to discover if the prices of natural and environmental resources better approximate their social cost. Here's an example taken from the indicators that are now published regularly by DEFRA, which give us information about 24 different components of our lifestyle. Here's the use of electricity, which, as you can see, has been rising from 1990, and also fossil fuels used in electricity generation have also been rising. CO2 emissions and some of the other gaseous emissions have been declining. There's the total electricity. So, since 1990, electricity consumption in the UK has risen by 23%, fossil fuel used in electricity generation by 6%, though emissions have actually decreased. However, decoupling economic growth and environmental impact clearly has a very long way to go. Very little impact so far in this particular factor. Another example here is taken from the work of Partha Das Gupta here in Cambridge, in which Partha draws our attention to the fact that as consumers we're not given real information about the real costs of our living. And I always think this is a very striking example. It's not a specific case, but it's typical of what very often happens where a country has policies continuing increases in growth, GNP per capita going up. But what Partha argues, that is a banal and flawed assessment, because if you include the cost of environmental impact, you then get the net national product, showing that while you might do pretty well between 0 and T1, up to T1 it starts to have a negative effect. And so here you see the unsatisfactory nature of an indicator that is used to tell us as individuals what our lifestyle is doing. And Partha argues how important it is to internalize the costs of the environmental impact, these externalities, to internalize them so that we get a more precise effect. On the right-hand side, you see a whole range of indicators that are now used to try to assess what our environmental impact is, our lifestyle impact. This is one in particular taken from Yale. These are the top countries, these are the bottom countries. This is the Environmental Sustainability Index. The UK sits somewhere in the middle here. So indicators are an important component in this area of looking at guiding principles that the government has set out. Now the second area, of course, has to do with businesses in the financial sector and industry, because they have a unique opportunity to make a difference. The world market in pollution control, in waste management, recycling and energy efficiency is about £400 billion. It's more than the global aerospace, chemicals or car industries. And a purely negative or restrictive approach to industry, businesses in the financial sector is unacceptable. That's not a starting point. Because when economic activity rises, the standard of living of the population rises, it relieves the distress of the poor, it's a component of God's will for the common good. In this sense, we thank God for the creation of wealth by economic activity, as it is one of the chief engines of progress and greater well-being. We celebrate it in this modern age, provided that it is coupled to equitable distribution and brings benefit to the disadvantaged. Historically, industrial practices underwent a huge change when it was discovered how dangerous CFCs were to the environment and caused this ozone hole, which you can see here, which has started to plateau as action has been taken. CFCs were banned and new types of refrigeration and so on, and spray cans were adopted. Nonetheless, it will take a century to get rid of the CFCs. It will take a century to repair the hole. And this reminds us of the long-term impact of our living styles today on the environment of the future. I just want to use 3 case studies to show what's been happening in the context of sustainable consumption and production in industry. Dell have been forced to recycle computers and address the e-waste problem by the Computer Take Back campaign. Nike have agreed #1 merchandiser of sports shoes in the world, over 10 billion sales. They've been targeted by Oxfam Community Aid Abroad, Hong Kong Christian Industrial Committee and the United Students Against Sweatshops. They've agreed to phase out toxic products in 10 years through green design, and it's now the #1 user of organic cotton for use in its garments, though it's still not accepted to pay a living wage to its workers. Staples, #1 retailer of paper, USA, annual sales $11 billion per year, agreed to phase out the sale of products made from endangered forests and achieve a minimum average of 30% post-consumer recycled content across its paper products. I think these examples remind us that the mission of Christian churches includes opposition to injustice, standing alongside the marginalised, as well as protection of the environment and intergenerational interests. The third area that I want to touch on in terms of deliberative democracy and public participation, it's an area that's favoured by some theorists who argue that participatory public debate is the route to change people's behaviour patterns as they take conscious decisions about their lifestyles and how it affects the future. Now, I want to tell you about the work of Clive Hamilton, who was a visiting fellow here, an economist from Australia, who during his sabbatical year found that during the last decade, he published this, 25% of British adults between the ages of 30 and 59, which includes a high proportion of you, downshifted their lifestyles, rising to 30% if you include those who stopped work to look after a baby or to set up a business. How did people think about it? Well, they felt they would have more time, more balance in their life, time with the family, more fulfillment, healthier lifestyle, living like a post-materialist, whatever that is. And other downshifters in the UK, happy, don't miss the money. Happy, miss the money. Happy, money lost very hard. Unhappy. And Clive Hamilton rejects an ideology and its social structures that are driven by what he calls growth fetish marketing. He argues that in a postmodern growth society, much greater attention should be devoted to the way people think about their lives and relationships and their well-being. Deliberative democracy and public participation is concerned with the common good and with loving my neighbour, yet changing patterns of behaviour is difficult, and we all know that. But particularly if it's intended to improve efficiency, which have their inbuilt limits, and the law of diminishing returns comes into play. Let me illustrate it with this example from some Swiss workers who compared two hypothetical products, A and B, where less polluting B could be replaced by A. So this gains 5 points in terms of environmental impact. This washing powder is more favourable than this one environmentally. It also saves time compared with this one, which needs longer period to act. So the effect is the cost per functional unit in terms of the disposable income, B is better off than A. But what does B do with his or her time? And what does B do with his or her increased disposable income? What happens here in terms of the number of functional units consumed per household? That is, the net effect of switching behaviour by substitution is rarely a single step function. And in consequence, the adoption of SCP is complex. People might decide that they want to, therefore, because they've got more money, they've got more time, they then consume other things instead. So I'd like to draw this together by showing this final slide, which speaks to us about sustainable consumption and production and value systems. The core idea is that there are immediate and long-term problems, which I hope I've been able to portray, with unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, not least in their low impact on an individual's well-being and how people perceive their happiness. And if we place the elements of sustainability in the context of values, we find that in many respects it derives its substance from Judeo-Christian teaching about stewardship and responsibility, as we can see here. Thought about the intergenerational criteria, concern for future generation. We thought about equitable distribution and the critique of greed, self-interest and exploitation that comes from the consideration of Christian values, dematerialization and informed consumption, which is focused on the integrity and renewal of the created order, which is a fundamental aspect again of Christian teaching, deliberative democracy and public participation, loving my neighbour and the common good. And so Flavio and I want to argue in this paper that a strategy of sustainable consumption and production based on the Christian value system has real value in terms of the repair and renewal of the created order. It also challenges individual lifestyles so that we understand better that medieval metaphor which speaks about the way in which we are reasoned agents of change rather than needy patients. Thank you very much. And perhaps I could just urge you by reminding you, since this is a Faraday seminar, that the immaturity of sustainable consumption and production as a strategy, I think it's worth just recalling Michael Faraday's lovely story about when he was asked by a senior figure of the day, what use is your latest discovery? And Faraday supposedly replied, of what good is a newborn baby?
Well, thank you, Sir Brian, for that thought-provoking talk. There's plenty of time now to raise questions or make comments, and I'm sure that Brian would be happy to respond to them. So does anybody want to make any comments? Yeah.
From one of your graphs, it looked as if there was a sort of minimum consumption that would lead to happiness. Is it possible to say, take the population of the world and arrive at that level with the world's resources? Has that calculation been done?
With the what resources?
With the resources that one might expect to be available on the top.
Yes.
Or should we actually have to aim at a lower level than that? So
Yes. I think the important point with sustainable consumption and production is that, and it's often misunderstood, because people automatically think that you're promoting the idea of reduced consumption. Sustainable consumption and production is really getting people to consider whether there's an alternative way of consuming whatever we do consume, producing what we produce, and to do it in a way which has much less environmental impact. And of course this is why it's always been quite difficult to push this idea with politicians and policymakers. But at last, for the first time that I'm aware of, and I speak about this area in quite a number of places, our government has actually set up a program to study the evidence that is needed by policymakers to see how we could adopt sustainable consumption and production. I don't think, clearly there is the resource issue. We have to look very clearly and very carefully at the extent to which we can reduce our resource use, but that involves doing things in an alternative way. One of the issues to which I don't know that there's any answer at all at the moment, but there are some people who are now beginning to model this question of how would sustainable consumption and production affect lifestyles. The question is whether, if we did adopt that as a really serious strategy, as Amartya Sen suggests, would it actually make us happier? Would the flatness of that graph, which indicates at the moment that we're not happier simply because we have an increase in GDP, GNP, but we don't know either whether we will be happier. Though the indications are that nowadays, particularly among the younger generation, there are so many more people who are concerned about the longer term impacts of our lifestyle, that it may well turn out that there would be a positive effect in terms of well-being.
So the hope would be that people might even be happier in that kind of situation.
I think certainly in terms of what we're trying to project here, which is that the Christian values that we're familiar with teach us that there are areas that clearly we're not fulfilling at the moment. And clearly as a society we need to adjust in order to get much closer to what those teachings are saying.
Over at the back, and then we'll come to the front.
So a lot of your scene setting for sustainability is based on good, solid secular data and very interesting data. I'm just wondering to what extent you think that the Christian position on sustainability is distinctive relative to right-thinking liberals everywhere, who it seems to me would agree with a lot of what you're saying.
No, I absolutely. And I think I think this is why we have to step back and try to put it in the framework of Christian teaching about living in society, which we've started to do. There aren't many actually who have moved in this direction so far. There are one or two, and I would commend the document that came out from Churches Together, which I think was a step in that direction, which was called Prosperity with a Purpose. And clearly there are strong elements that I think we can bring out in terms of the Christian perception of this area. The extent to which this idea has been picked up within the Christian community, I think, is disturbingly small. And it's quite clear that, as many of you heard me say before, and I think it's a general view, that the Christian church has clearly missed out hugely in terms of the environmental movement of the 70s and the 80s, and that was hijacked by other interest groups. The hope we have is that by exposing this area, that the churches will actually take a much greater interest in it and start to own it and start to work out what it means in terms of the Christian perspective. And in that sense, I think it's encouraging the Jubilee Centre have initiated a programme which Bob and several others are involved in, together with the fact that the Catholic Bishops' Conference have also identified this as one of the key areas that they want to look at in the future. So I think there is beginning to be some movement that there is a need to have a much more serious analysis of this from a Christian perspective and not simply from the point of view of the well-meaning liberal, as you say. We may even find that we can work together on certain aspects. But at the same time, I think we would hope that there's something distinctive we can say, which has to do with our understanding of biblical teaching.
So Brian, do you have any comment to make on the discrepancy between individuals who are very good Christians perhaps on a Sunday, but when they go into their work as company directors on a Monday morning, the impersonal corporate entity and the needs of that corporate entity to beat the competition and meet high productivity levels take over, and that the Christian values to some extent go out the window.
Yeah.
And the idea that Adam Smith was first and foremost a moral philosopher and was very concerned not just about productivity and better productivity, but also the effect on workers and customers.
Mary, I think you will know as well as me that in the business world, social corporate responsibility is the familiar phrase that is used these days to try to raise awareness that there are other elements in business life and in industry that have been pushed to the side in many cases, particularly when you go into work on a Monday morning. But I come back to what I found encouraging, and that is the three companies that I referred to that have been challenged, particularly by NGOs. And I think NGOs have a very important part to play in this. Actually, I was with Christian NGOs who are also taking it up. But I think NGOs do have an important part to play in challenging industry and businesses, and particularly also the financial sector. I think it's very true of all of us, I suspect, who are Christians, that when we move into the workplace, there is a great danger that one is sucked into a way of thinking that is commonplace. But it is very important, and I'm sure we all try in our particular way to try to ensure that we are holding on to that transformation that occurs through an experience in the Christian life, which brings a different value system. And I'm actually encouraged that not only that there are certain companies that are looking at this quite seriously, but there are organisations that are making a deliberate attempt to do that. Let me give you a local example, which is the Cambridge Programme for Industry, which for the last 10 years, funded by the Prince of Wales and John Brown of BP, has been working on the social responsibility in the workplace. They have now decided for the next 10 years to make a commitment to sustainable consumption and production. And there's already 15 top companies in the USA which met here recently in Windsor Castle to discuss the way forward for the next 10 years, who have committed their companies to SCP, and I think the fact that there are 15 CEOs who have agreed to do that may say there's something in this for the businesses.
Yes, main thing I want to say. This is obviously from the science-religion interface, but I also go to the interfaith stream or program, and that's very important now for the church. So look, in this case, surely we can look at the Buddhists. If you've got, I've been to Buddhist meetings, the first thing they ever tell you is the dematerialisation, lack of attachment to material objects. And from the Hindu tradition, of course, going back beyond the historical span of Judeo-Christian, they've been vegetarians. And the figure I carry with me is that you can produce 7 times the amount of food for vegetarians as you would have to for a meat eater with the same resources. So can you include that in your advice?
Yes, thank you. I think it's, you raise an interesting point, and it's something we discuss. And I think it may well be that this whole theme has to be looked at from a broader context and not just a Christian context. I think there are important contributions that can be made by other faiths in this area. I would still want to say that I think there is a uniqueness that we should emphasize in terms of the Christian understanding of this area, but I would certainly not wish in any sense to belittle or to put to one side contributions that can be made from other faiths. And already there has started to be quite a discussion about how this aspect is perceived by other groups. Of course, it's perhaps our Jewish friends who are closer to many of the areas that we've been thinking about over this lunch period. But there are others, both in Islam, to Buddhism to an extent, and other philosophers. And here I have to start including Confucianism, because the Chinese friends would say there are elements that they would want to highlight in terms of a discussion of this subject. And of course it's extremely important that the Chinese do address this area particularly with a huge growth rate at the present time.
Dr. Adlin.
So I have a question that links back to your previous points about these captains of industry who got together and said they wanted to focus on sustainable consumption and production. So my own limited experience is from Gabon, where my father has a little environmental consulting company, and so he goes out into the jungle and works with oil companies there. And one of the interesting things is that the amount of business we get is very much dependent not only on the fluctuations of the oil price, but also derivatives. Whether it's going to go up, if it's going well, then they're quite happy to pay for a bit more environmental things, and if it's not, then they very radically cut it. Okay. And the other interesting thing is that on the ground, the local managers you talk to, they all feel that some kind of moral responsibility to do something and to make sure that their production is more sustainable. But the people making decisions are back in Europe or in the US and are very disconnected from this. And I have always a feeling that in the end of the day, it's really money which makes a difference. The only reason why these companies now pay us to do some kind of environmental remediation is because they're worried about NGOs like Greenpeace, and they're worried about people boycotting them back here. And that seems to be, in the end of the day, in spite of all their woolly good words, the only thing that really brings us business. Okay. And so I wonder, when you want to change society, when you want to change, say, a company and its way it makes sustainable production, you have. I wonder, and how far you're going to get with this convincing people this is something good for the general whole, and how much far you're going to get with less conciliatory ways of trying to convince them that it's for their bottom line.
Yep. Important question. Let's go back to climate change, shall we, to start with, and that is that the increasing evidence that is emerging inevitably has to cause people who run big businesses to look at what their longer term future is and also what their short term strategy should be. And I think that the evidence that is emerging increasingly for society to consider has to drive people to think of an alternative paradigm. Now, whether this is a paradigm that is actually going to resonate is the big question. Whether it's actually going to penetrate into areas of the type that you just mentioned. As I said, I specialised in this presentation on the question of the first world because I so often find people switch the argument to the less developed countries. There are, and your question is perfectly valid and a very important one, but I am concerned that we don't duck out of it by saying, well, these are disconnected. And this is something that is happening in a different part of the world from what is being considered by big business sitting in Manhattan or wherever. And I think we have to take some encouragement and be positive about the fact that there are CEOs who are thinking differently. And this is the reason I gave you the statistic over the question of the value of the environmental industry and the pollution industry. It's a huge figure that has now evolved. And for those reasons, I think it's very important that we have an input into those discussions to try to make sure that this argument is pressed as hard as possible and that we simply don't let it drift and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. I think there are pressures that are coming now on governments that they have to look at these alternatives, and this is one of them.
I'm not going to make you responsible for the United States, you'll be relieved to know, but it's interesting that in the U.S. polling data is, on environmental issues is always very, very high. There's a very favorable view of environmental regulation, but that never seems to get translated into any kind of policy change. Or, do you have any sort of sense of how you take what may in fact be a kind of grassroots environmental consensus and translate that into meaningful governmental and market-based change? I mean, in a sense, that's what this whole thing is about.
That's a challenge. Yes. Okay, let me show you, let me just show a slide here. Mr. Bush made his statement a couple of weeks ago, as you remember, and this is this response in USA Today the day after in terms of the US addiction to oil. And of course the projection, and there are some states of course where bioethanol is beginning to be quite a big product, and the projections from this go way up of course if you believe them. So I think on the energy issue in particular, which of course is so central to the whole of living systems and to all of us, here is one option. Okay, it's politically driven. No longer does the USA want to be dependent on these sources of fossil fuel, but there is this alternative approach that might well open up a door to sustainable production and to a more sustainable consumption system. That is the idea of growing maize, and at the moment of course it's only the seed of maize that is used to produce this bioethanol, but the other technologies that go along with that, which have to do with the way in which you might be able to use a whole plant by enzymatic destruction and heat treatments, you may well be able to have a much greater yield. So these are questions that are being scrutinised very closely at the present time. So here is one opening in terms of policy. I suppose the other best example that we should refer to, of course, is the slide I showed right at the beginning, which is the example of the way in which, at long last, evangelical leaders in the USA, evangelical Christian leaders, have acknowledged that global climate change might be real, and that people like Sir John Horton and so on, who's been speaking to them, and also he's been speaking on 2 occasions to President Bush. On the first occasion he was thrown out, on the second occasion Bush listened to him, putting forward the view that in terms of a Christian perspective of this issue, there are alternatives that have to be considered. And I think it's this sort of involvement which contributes to introducing arguments that have to do with an alternative paradigm. I think that's important that that's done. Now, how effective that is going to be remains to be seen, but we have many historical examples of where Christian leaders did have an impact in a social sense, and this may be one of those occasions when it's needed.
Thank you. We just have 2 minutes. We'll stop at 2 because we know other people have things to get to. But Patrick, would you like to give us your last question?
I have preached using the data about happiness not increasing past a certain level of income, but if I were to argue against it, I might worry that there's more than just a hedonistic impulse, that people seem to have other drives, so it may not work to show them that they're happier. They still feel a drive to compete or to produce. And it worries me even more that there may even be some things that have some moral weight, such as support for the health service and for the very poor, may fall so that even though I can afford to downsize and live a comfortable life and just regret slightly that I can't get on the housing ladder and things, if everybody did that, then certain very needy people would really begin to suffer the effects. So though we might not increase our happiness levels, we might be moderately happy for longer if we had more money. Do you see the sort of...
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that I concertina the whole research area into about 4 minutes, and there are all these other dimensions which you quite rightly raise, which feed into this whole analysis of what it is that make people feel they are experiencing a good quality of life. And I accept entirely what you say. I mean, we can't, there is a danger of oversimplifying, and in a sense I did oversimplify, but I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the argument that says that consumption in itself is something that is satisfying and is going to meet all the requirements of a person's life, there's a big question mark over that, and I think it is something that needs repeating from time to time, and for that reason I introduced it as a way of saying what's the alternative paradigm, and an alternative paradigm, as I try to portray, could be SCP. How that's worked out in practice, whether it really means that you have, or your neighbour has to downshift, or whether you do things in a different way, I think the crucial thing is to make sure that people are aware that there is an alternative paradigm and it has to be formulated.